Alright YouTube, so we're back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So it has been snowing pretty much non-stop for 2 days now, where I live at. And it's kind of got me thinking about these snowy parts of FF7 and wanting to discuss them, specifically mostly the Great Glacier, because there's the Icicle Inn, the snowboarding segment, the Great Glacier, and like Guy's Cliff. I think for the most part the other three will probably be roughly the same, like Icicle Inn, like they're obviously going to have more stuff there, more story segment. You're going to be there longer than you were in the original FF7, but I think relatively the same. The snowboarding minigame, they're going to have some sort of iteration of it. We've seen them do it with like the bike minigame with Motorball in the original FF7. They did a pretty good job of that, I think, with Remake. And then with like Guy's Cliff, I'm sure it'll be mostly the same as well. But what I want to kind of focus in on the Great Glacier is, for starters, it's probably the overall most unique location when it comes to the original Final Fantasy VII. All the way down to actually how you enter the location, hopping back to the snowboarding minigame. While you're snowboarding down to the Great Glacier, there's a couple different like paths you can take, a couple different forks in the road, and depending on which ones you take and where they go left or right, you actually end up in a different location in the Great Glacier. There's actually, I believe, 4 different starting areas depending on the paths that you took while snowboarding, which already makes it a super unique location compared to anything else in FF7, because you can really only go forward, right? Like, you can go into a cave, and maybe there's a bunch of different rooms and loading screens you go through, paths to explore, but you can really only enter one way and exit one way. So that alone made me want to kind of talk about this and discuss, like, how are they going to handle something like the Great Glacier when it comes to Remake. Now, this is going to either be Part 2 or Part 3, right? Depending on how far they go into the game with Part 2, we might see this location. With the way I think they're going to handle Part 2, we wouldn't be going to this location yet, so this would technically be a video kind of talking about something that may be in Part 3. But still. So the first question we got to ask is, will there be multiple entrances to the Great Glacier? If you take a different path each time when snowboarding, assuming that there are different paths, would you land in a different location, start from a different location? It's kind of hard to say, obviously. It's just speculation. We're just discussing here. It obviously really comes down to what they do with the next game. With what they do with Part 2, how are the locations going to be? Is there, for one, even an overworld map? Is there any sort of level of exploration? Is it like a big area you can walk around and explore, or is it like a big area that you're kind of still just walking forward with? Any sort of level of exploration, or the lack thereof, before the Great Glacier would kind of give us an idea of how they may want to handle this location. Also, any sort of choices. Like, is there any way to tackle certain locations multiple ways? Like, can you come into a cave and exit it multiple different ways? Or, like, go into, like, a building or something like that and exit multiple different ways? Because if not, then it kind of would paint the picture that maybe they won't do the same thing with the Great Glacier. Now, that being said, as I pointed out earlier in the video, it is its own pretty unique location, even in the original FF7, so no matter what they do with Remake Part 2 or Part 3, this location itself could be very isolated and very different from the rest of the game, so it might still have the multiple different entrances. Now look, obviously with stuff like this, we're just speculating, we're just talking about and discussing what they may or may not do with the future of Remake. Our hopes is that it's the same. I do hope that once we get to Icicle Inn, do the story stuff there, take the snowboard from the little kid, that we have a relatively in-depth minigame with snowboarding that has diverging paths, multiple different obstacles, and different places that you can land within the Great Glacier. One of the other things that's very unique about the Great Glacier compared to every other location in Final Fantasy VII is that it has its own map, and it's a complete optional map that you can get in Icicle Inn. You don't have to have it, you don't need it to get through there. It can be helpful, but also at the same time, it's kind of not helpful in its own way. And what I mean by that is, if we use just the world map of Final Fantasy VII as an example, it updates in real time, kind of like most maps for any game. No matter where you're at on the world map, where you have it pulled up in the bottom corner, like a mini-map, or you pull up the full map, it'll show you exactly where your character is. This map does not do that. So right here's the Great Glacier map, and obviously it is very, very useful nowadays. Like, as a kid, it wouldn't help me. If it wasn't live update, I had no idea where the fuck I was, but there's obviously images on the map, and that's what you're supposed to use to kind of know which area you're in, and obviously you're headed for the check mark at the top of the map. So what I'm curious about when it comes to Remake is, because we constantly have a mini-map, and also a map that we can reference, whether or not we're going to even have this map to find and to be able to use, and once we come to the Great Glacier, if we have this map, we're going to have to rely on it. And what I think would be interesting with this location, especially to make it stand out from the rest of Remake, is that they do get rid of the minimap. Maybe the snowstorm, the weather, that could be the reason, the excuse for why we don't have our own map and why we don't have a minimap. Other games do this. Final Fantasy XII is an example I can think of. Certain locations, depending on what's happening or the weather, would completely get rid of the minimap to where it's not even useful for you. And I think this would be a smart idea to do with the Great Glacier and kind of have to rely on that. Now, having said that, they would probably then make getting the map for the Great Glacier mandatory with whatever the story is within the Icicle Inn. Also, oddly enough, Final Fantasy XII had a similar map, but definitely way less useful than the one with the Great Glacier that you could look at and reference. It actually live updated, but it didn't help you. Something else that can make this location pretty difficult to explore is that oftentimes once you come into like a new area, you go through a load screen, you almost always have like 2 or 3 new different directions to go. And this is where obviously the map can come in handy because, for example, if you happen to come across the individual tree by itself, you know that you need to walk west-northwest to the tree bridge, from there northwest to the stone tree, and then from there east to the exit. And it's something that I hope we have when it comes to Remake with the Great Glacier segment, is this kind of primitive way of navigating. It's really easy to use the mini-map. It's really easy to pull up the big map in the menu and know where you're going and know where to go. It'd be kind of nice to have this like kind of dialed back where you kind of have to use your surroundings to know which way to go. Some other things to add on to the unique factor when it comes to the Great Glacier is there's like several different sort of mini games. You have this one ice one that you have to hop onto the floating icebergs without stepping on the submerged ones in a certain pattern to get across, and then you have to do it on your way back as well. There's also another unique section that's not necessarily a mini game, but it's very easy to like lose your way because the camera keeps spinning with the weather, and you have these poles that stay behind you that kind of let you know which direction to keep going. Also, if you want to hop past the Great Glacier section just a little bit, you have the Guy's Cliff mini game where you have to like warm up your body as you're climbing. One of my other favorite things about the Great Glacier, especially compared to Remake itself, is missable loot, man. Hidden loot, hidden treasure. That's something that Remake didn't really have. I mean, technically, you don't have to loot anything. You can miss things if you want to, but there's not really any hidden, like, secret items, right, that you have to, like, super go out of your way to get. For example, within the Great Glacier, you have the Alexander Summon materia. For literal years, I didn't even know this existed. You know, I never used a walkthrough guide, never had a strategy guide, never used the internet or anything like that to, like, look up things for FF7. Like, I just played the game a lot of times for a lot of years. And I didn't even know this existed. And then one time, I think on one of my subsequent playthroughs, I think I, for whatever reason, hadn't played in years, was like stuck on the Great Glacier and decided to look it up. And as I'm looking up like a walkthrough for the Great Glacier, I learned about the Alexander Summon materia for the first time. And I was like, what are you fucking kidding me? I've just been here this whole time? So for somebody like me who at that point had played through FF7 quite a few times, learned something brand new just by referencing that. Like, this has been hidden in the game the whole time, did not know about it. That's something that, you know, I wish Remake had. Obviously, it wouldn't be hidden for long with the way the world is now with the internet and shit like that. But it'd be nice to have something that's, like, really hard to like, find and get. But not only is the Alexander materia found in a particular location, you also have to do, like, one weird step to make it be able to be got. And you have to, like, activate a hot spring within the Great Glacier and then go back to that particular location and fight an enemy there. And then they will leave behind the Alexander materia. And that might honestly be why I never, like, found this at a younger age. Maybe I just didn't think to go there. Maybe I explored all of the Great Glacier, but never really backtracked to other locations. Now, that's obviously, like, a lot of years ago at this point, like 15 years or some shit ago. But it's still nice that, you know, I played the game for a lot of years before that and then found something new. Something else that also adds on more to the uniqueness of the Great Glacier is that you can actually only explore it for a set amount of time each time. And it's roughly about 544 steps. And once it happens, you pass out from the cold, I think it is, and you end up at this old dude's cabin. And by old dude, I mean Mr. Halsoff, but I think it is possible with the original FF7, with certain guides. I think you gotta maybe land in a particular area with the snowboarding minigame. I think you can hit, like, every location and get every, like, item within the Great Glacier and still make it out there without passing out. I could be wrong there, or maybe you can get, like, most of them in one trip. When it comes to Remake, that's not a feature I'm necessarily striving for. It's not my favorite feature about FF7, but if they had it in there, I wouldn't necessarily hate it, just because it was in the original game as well. I think overall, the Great Glacier has potential to be maybe the most unique location when it comes to Remake. Now, maybe not the most interesting or the most fun, but between, like, the different kind of mini-games, the different kinds of navigation, the lack of a mini-map, the hidden items, like, little secrets you gotta do to even access certain hidden items, like, that could be really, really interesting, man. And because of all those different things that make it such a standout location when it comes to the original Final Fantasy VII, I hope that they keep most, if not all of that, intact when it comes to Remake Part 2 or 3. My dudes, I think that's going to be just about the video. I'm starting to freeze my ass off. I live in an old house that does not have central heat and air, so I got to turn off my little space heater to even record stuff. So I've been here for like an hour or 2 or 3, whatever it's been. I'm just freezing. I'm dying over here. I feel like Cloud in the Great Glacier. I get immersive when it comes to recording my videos, my dudes. I try to get in the character's shoes, experience what they are experiencing. But of course, from there, I want to pass it off to you guys. As with most of our videos on the channel here, it's a discussion. What do you think they're going to do with the Great Glacier? Do you think they're going to keep all these different things that make it such a standout, unique location in the original FF7? Or are they going to keep all that stuff intact when it comes to Remake Part 2 or 3? Or do you think they're going to dial back on a lot of those features to make it more accessible to the wider kind of mainstream gaming audience? My dudes, that's going to be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't able to do more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT, and my Discord. Links to my Snowbox are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.